Hi, welcome. My name is David Plylar. I'm in the music division at the Library of Congress, and I'm very pleased to see so many people here. Actually, we don't usually get too many at noontime, so it's nice to see you. I'm going to be giving a talk about some of our Rachmaninoff holdings, rather not just our Rachmaninoff holdings, but things that are related to and tangential to our very large Rachmaninoff holdings. And it's under the basic overview of rewriting Rachmaninoff. And I'll go through the various types of things that I'll mention. And I should just say that the things that I will focus on represent just a small portion of what is actually in our archives. So here's the man of the hour. This was a picture that is found in the papers of Nikolai Medtner, who's another fantastic composer, friend of Rachmaninoff's. And we have a couple of his manuscripts, but a decent amount of correspondence and other types of papers, including some photographs, so pulled that one out. So the types of things that we're going to take a look at in a very overview sort of way today will be types of sketching. So this is a type of writing. This is representing some of the earliest stages. Editing, different types of editing we'll take a look at. There's the editing that goes from modifying from sketch to a draft, to say a rough draft. There's the ones that go from editing a printed final draft into a just kind of fixing mistakes types of editing. And then there are other types of things that will come up as we'll see. Then we'll also look at revising. And this is something that is a feature of our Rachmaninoff archive. There's a good amount of material in there. Most of the material from there post-dates 1916. Yet we have some referential works that go to works from 1892 or so. And the way that he does that is just through revisions of particular works. So we'll take a look at those. Then we'll look at another way of rewriting Rachmaninoff, and this is transcribing. There's transcription of himself. He did this not as much as one would think. A few of his songs he transcribed for himself, and we'll look at one of those in a bit more in depth. And then the transcriptions that he did of others' music. So we'll look at some Bach, Mendelssohn, and some other things that we'll see here. Then there's his role as being transcribed. And in particular, I chose two kind of expedients of this, which would be two other performer composers, Jascha Heifetz and Fritz Kreisler. So we'll be taking a look at a few of their works that are transcriptions for violin and piano of works that were originally for solo piano by Rachmaninoff. So before you can do any of this, there's the process of finding all of these materials. So the ones that kind of went into this particular presentation, we drew largely from the Sergei Rachmaninoff archive, which came to us through Rachmaninoff's widow. But there's also material in there that came through the daughter of Rachmaninoff's cousin, Alexander Salati, who was a student of Liszt, one of Rachmaninoff's early piano teachers, and a fantastic transcriber, actually, also, and should be better known. But his daughter contributed some of these in the 70s, and Rachmaninoff's widow contributed them in the 1951, I think. Then we have one particular item out of the Heinemann Foundation collection. We have several items from the Fritz Kreisler collection, the Jascha Heifetz collection. I decided not to use materials from the Andrei Kostelanetz collection because some of the ones I wanted weren't here, and also because they kind of represent orchestral transcriptions, and I think it's easier just in the amount of time that we have just to look at some more small-scale types of transcriptions. And lastly, the Medtner papers. So I wanted to just give you an example of what it's like to look for these items. So I'm trying to find this particular item. I think it's some type of correspondence in the Medtner papers somewhere. I found it, so I'm happy about that. And so I'm going to look at it. It doesn't quite seem what I thought it was going to be. It's a little bit heavier. And in fact, I'm kind of nonplussed here. Let's see, it's Medtner's hands. So this was an unexpected type of thing to find in there, but it's the kind of thing that that one does find, and it's a kind of a neat aspect of looking through these collections. This one was unexpected, though, and this is definitely not staged to look like this. The funny thing is that I actually have this. I have this hand problem that follows me around. I went to the Liszt house in Weimar, and I bought a plaster cast of his left hand, and I brought it back, and I got stopped at customs, and they said, like, "Excuse me, sir, do you have any body parts in your luggage?" And so I had to, quickly say yes, but it was okay because it was Liszt. So anyway, back to kind of the more focused element here. Sketching. There's a lot of sketch materials in the Rachmaninoff archive. A number of them are in these sketchbooks that have specific pieces that they're, or a few pieces in each book. Some of them are separate, are held separately. We're not going to be looking at ones from the Second Symphony or the Corelli variations, but we will take a look at the Piano Concerto No. 4 and the Rhapsody on a theme of Paganini. And we'll start with this one. I apologize that it's so light. It's just some of Rachmaninoff's pencil work gets very light, so I try to get some contrast here. But what you see here on the left, if you can kind of make it out, is those top two staves are piano writing, and then the bottom two are the two directly underneath it, the ones that are empty up at the top, are for the orchestral short score. So these are, it's just a way to kind of organize your ideas as you're getting things together. It's interesting because this is in a fairly advanced state, even though it looks a little bit bereft of detail. And what I'll do is I'll play some examples for you towards the end of the time here, so you can hear some of this. But what's interesting is that what Rachmaninoff does with the orchestra is limited to punctuated chords, whereas in the final version, he expands it quite a bit. But yet you see this same basic shape that you see here, so already at this stage. Here's another one that is probably familiar to you if you could see it. And again, I'm sorry about the lightness of it. This is the famous 18th variation, which is the inversion variation that, strangely enough, Nikolai Metner used in one of his piano sonatas before Rachmaninoff did this. But anyway, it does still make sense because it's the inversion variation. But you'll notice that it says the 17th. So this is an early stage of it where it has mostly the piano part written out. And again, I'll play a little bit for you later. So there's those types of sketches, and those are interesting, and there are a ton of them. And it's a very interesting and worthwhile pursuit if you're a scholar to come in and study these if you have a particular interest in a particular piece. And you can learn a lot about the compositional process. Just as much, I think, with we won't really look specifically at editing, like proof pages or anything like that, but we'll kind of skip ahead to editing and revising, this process of taking what you've already called done and remaking it anew. And so some of the earliest ones that Rachmaninoff edited, excuse me just a moment, come from his this early piano set, the Morceau de Fantasy, fantasy pieces, Opus 3. The most famous of these pieces is the Prelude in C sharp minor, which is the number 2. And so you've probably heard that piece a lot, but maybe not these other ones. These were finished in 1892. Around 1940, Rachmaninoff decided to revise 2 of them. The 2 that he chose to revise were the Melody and the Serenade. So the Melody is the first. You can see the first version up on the top. It has a very simple punctuated accompaniment. But the second version, which you can see is the melody is the same, except it's not exactly the same. It has a triplet instead of a dotted figure and stuff like that. The accompaniment has changed. It's actually morphed to be much more like his preludes, Opus 23 and 32, that come a bit later in the early 20th century. So in this case, it still has the same basic overall structure, but it has a completely different affect. And we'll hear a little bit of that with Rachmaninoff playing that in a bit. Another major change that you can see is the first version has a very quiet ending that involves this kind of expanded arpeggio, a la Chopin or something like that. And you can see that Rachmaninoff has completely revised the ending in the manuscript. And this one, no, this is correct, sorry. In this one, what we're looking at is a bit further into the serenade where it turns into a waltz. And what you have in the first one is just a very simple rolled chord accompaniment in the right hand. And then on the bottom one, it has a slightly different division of labor between the hands, as well as having those grace notes included. This is just it's more of a character kind of revision that he would make. So that's just, it's not that it changes the melody or anything like that. It's more that it has this interesting effect on what you're doing. And what I found with a lot of his changes is that he often manipulated which hand was intended to play which part. So in the early days, while he still paid good attention to it, he paid a different kind of attention to it that I think came through his experience as a performer later in life. A lot of his early pieces were actually promoted and played by Salati, and not as much him until he kind of grew as a musician and had more opportunities for himself. Here's an example of just the types of revisions that you would see even in the context of a draft revision. In this case, the crossed out section at the top is basically reverting to an earlier revised idea. So just you can see that these are still very much working manuscripts, even though it's in very good shape. Even Rachmaninoff would make a mistake every once in a while. When we get to another set of pieces, he decided to, again, just take one and make some slight variations on it. The thing I want you to see here, the first version's on top, and the second version's on the bottom. This is a humoresque from another set of salon pieces, the Opus 10 set. And you'll pretty much see that it's almost exactly the same, with a few melodic differences and then a very clear harmonic difference at the very end, those last two punctuated chords. In the top version, you'll see that they're listed with the sforzandi, and you'll see a G in the bass and an E flat in the bass. And in the bottom one, you'll see that he turns that into a fifth, a dyad of F sharp and C sharp, moving up to G and D. So there are those types of things that seem minor and, sorry, unintended, but end up being having quite a big effect on the sound that you hear. So clearly, I have a suspicion that one of the things that he would do is that he would, through the process of playing these over the years, he would always just have this idea of, this is again, supposition here, but he would have this sense of, one day I'm going to get around to changing this to what I really want it to be. A lot of composers do this. They kind of say, oh, well, one day I'll go back and revise. So that one day kind of came for Rachmaninoff for a lot of these pieces in 1940 and 1941. And that's partially due to his circumstances at the time, but also I think that he finally just found himself having the time to do it. Other types of changes are more subtle. So this is in the Moments musicaux, basically a really beautiful set of pieces from 1896. If you look at the top one, which is the original version, they're just little things that are they're different. You'll see this is towards the end of the first page of the material. You'll see that there's still these little triplet notes in between in the right hand. So the right hand's playing a melody in octaves, and then there are these triplets kind of going on in the middle. What he does in the second version is he keeps the triplets going, the sextuplets in this case, in the left hand, but switches to groups of 2 and 4 in the right hand. He doesn't always do this, as you notice in that second measure. By the second half of the measure, he's back to using the sextuplet, but he's actually switched so that the left hand is doing the duple. This is the kind of technique that you find in Rachmaninoff quite a bit, where it's a way of kind of creating this emphasis or sense of slowdown and kind of of emphasis just by changing that inner, even though the tempo's not changing that inner pulse to just be slightly slower, 2 against 3. And so he'll do this at these particular points where he's doing something interesting melodically or whatever. Another interesting aspect of this is that it's a completely opposite dynamic conception of the piece. On the top, you have a fortissimo at that D flat that you see right in the center. And in the bottom, the revised version, it's gone down to a piano. Hard to be much further from that, from each other. So that's an interesting thing. It might be, again, I think, evolution through practice, potentially, or just another reading. That's kind of an interesting thing about many of these great performers, is that they don't always play the same piece the same way twice. And so it's kind of a pleasure to get a chance to see these revisions and see their own reinterpretations of their own material. Here's just a page from that. So let's see what that looks like. Light pencil again. We get to a much more substantial set of revisions with the Fourth Piano Concerto. How many of you know this piece? Oh, okay, well, more people than I would think, because a lot of people just don't know this piece. It doesn't get played that much, and it was a bit of a disappointment for Rachmaninoff because he was getting a lot of criticism about it. It was first composed in 1926, and we have a score over there that you can take a look at afterwards of that. But he decided, I think he dabbled with it over the years, but especially in 1941, he decided to really take a new look at it. So a lot of it had to do with making the material more concise. So if you can bear with me to see what you can see here, what you see on the left is a page of the published score that's been crossed out, and you have on the right is a page that's next to it in manuscript. That if you notice that the piano line down towards the bottom, let me see if I can you see that cursor? Yeah. So this piano line here is what you see. Where is it? Wait, why did that? Okay, it's upside down. So that's so his revision. His first step was to invert it so that it was right side up, which was a very good move on his part. So imagine that in that case that his more sophisticated revision was that he had this manuscript page take the place of what's there. Hopefully these are okay, good. And then as that manuscript continues, he then elides it with what you'll see at the end of the page that's also crossed off on the right, which is now right side up. And so that last measure is what's led into by the last measure on the manuscript side. So the manuscript side goes into that. So there's those types of kind of interpolative. In this case, it was actually a reduction in the number of measures. So you lose some material, and I think not bad material either. Other types of changes, you can see paste overs, different figurations. You'll lose a measure. For instance, with you'll see that he crosses out a measure and then again uses an elision technique with the scale that connects to whatever that next one is. Oftentimes you'll see that taking, kind of cut and paste it by using the piano scale or some type of piano figuration as the kind of stitching that will connect the parts. In the second movement, which is a really lovely movement, he also apparently felt that it was too long. So you have reorchestrations that come in, you have excision of repetitive measures. In the case of this, again, I'm not questioning Rachmaninoff, but I do think there is something to be gained by hearing this material more than what is done in the final version. And you can actually hear, there's a recording of the 1926 version, so you can kind of hear them and compare them. It's about 5 minutes longer. Again, more types of changes that were changes to the figuration to kind of give it the characteristic that you know from the concerto today. Some of those things were not first thoughts. So these repeated chords are an example of that. Okay, so we have over here a bunch of these examples that you can take a look at after this talk of the fourth concerto in particular, just so you can see the range of what he's doing with various media. So there's the manuscript insertions, there's a block of manuscript that is a rewriting of the entire, or most of the third movement. There's annotation of the printed score, which is quite a lot of annotation. So there's all that is going on with this piece that he really wanted to revise. Another thing that Rachmaninoff was interested in was transcription. Excuse me. And so he didn't do a ton of self-transcription, but he did do this with several of his songs. I'm skipping ahead of myself. First, there's his, we do have one manuscript related to the famous C-sharp minor prelude, and that's the two-piano arrangement of it. So this counts, in my view, as a transcription of a piece for solo piano, made now for two pianos. It's understood that Rachmaninoff was not a big fan of the piece because it was the one that was always played and he always had to play, but he certainly got some mileage out of it for sure, and it sort of helped to kind of solidify his name. I know for me, it was one of those first pieces where I saw, 4 staves, on one page for one player, thinking, how are you supposed to do that? And so I was thinking, oh, well, maybe in the two-piano version, it'll be 8 staves or something. But, it doesn't, it makes it a lot easier to play. So it didn't do that. But so Rachmaninoff failed me there. But otherwise, this version is not played too often. I'm trying to think of, I know it's been recorded, but there are also other two-piano versions that have been done. So anyway, so we have this in the collection. And this one is, this next one is from a set of 8 songs. It's published as a set of 6 songs, the Opus 38 songs. And this is, I think it's from 1916, yeah. And it's a really light manuscript, very delicate, and so it's really hard to see what's written there. But this is one of his famous Daisies songs. So you probably have heard a recording of him playing it. And so this is the original, though. And what's fascinating about this, and this is one of the things I'll show in the little audio segment at the end, what's fascinating about this is that there is a complete reconception of the piece. While the pitches stay roughly the same, there's a reconception of what constitutes the melody. In the song, you have this particular profile that is absolutely beautiful. His songs, by the way, if you don't know them, are just wonderful. But it maintains this kind of, it's primary, but it's also secondary to what's happening in the piano and the upper parts and the accompanimental parts. But you never lose the sense of the singer being the focus. What happens in the piano version and also in the violin and piano versions is that there's a shift from that vocal line to, while you do hear it, in certain prominent places like when it first enters, there's a shift to where you start to hear what had been kind of a accompanimental counter melody. It starts to become more prominent and take a greater role than the original vocal part. So that's something that is universally done by Rachmaninoff and our 2 others that we have here, Fritz Kreisler's transcription of it, and also Heifetz transcription. So here's the Rachmaninoff version. You can kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about here. This is a little bit easier to see than the last one, but still not great to see. In that second system, you'll see about 3 beats in, there's a group of 9 notes, I think. So that's kind of that secondary counter melody line in the original. But here it's the focus of what's happening, kind of by default. I mean, because the piano is not a sustaining instrument in the way that the voice is. This is the Heifetz. I think it's cutting off, sorry. So this is the Heifetz transcription for violin and piano. What you'll notice, again, is that if you look at the end of that first system, again, that group of I think it's 9, I can't quite see myself, that ornamental figure is given a prominence in the violin part. Interestingly, in the Kreisler version, which I don't have as a slide, but I do have out over here, you'll see that he takes it at a different octave. So there's very different conceptions of how to approach transcription. And that's why I enjoy, personally, getting a chance to take a look at way different composers do these things. It's better if you can hear them actually play it, too, like at least with Rachmaninoff you could. So Rachmaninoff also spent a decent amount of time transcribing others. Some of his early work that he did, that I think some of it is lost, but he did a 4-hands version of the Manfred Symphony by Tchaikovsky. Also, I think he did Sleeping Beauty. I think that one's still around, but later on, when mature transcriptions include things like part of a Bach violin partita. So this is actually we have several manuscripts related to this transcription. This is a sketch version, and I wanted to show you that instead of the kind of more fully worked out one, which is over there, which again is hard to see. But what I would like you to notice is that there's already a division between the hands of what is playing what. So it's part of the character of the prelude is kind of created by this, what's happening mechanically with the arms, like the way that he wants you to play it. You could just play that with one hand and it would be fine, and I'm sure that some pianists do that. But by indicating it in this way and having it conceived in this way from an early stage, it shows that he's looking for a particular type of character, at least to me. Okay. From that same set, he also did two other sections, a gavotte and a gigue. And in the gavotte, you can just see a few more types of, this is essentially a almost ready to go draft. But you can see that in that close-up on the right, you can see some second thoughts, some light pencil alternative thoughts, and also you see some fingerings, and also different slurrings, etc. So he's still making those types of decisions as he's going. With that same gavotte, there's two different versions that are here. And so there's an earlier version, and then there's the final version. The final version is actually on top, and the earlier version is down below. But what you'll notice in that earlier version is that there's a moving line in the middle with the eighth notes that are kind of going between each chord, whereas he's settled on chords in the upper version. So in these transcriptions, there's also, it's not that one is better or worse than the other, really, in my view. It's that there's just different approaches and different types of benefits with each type of circumstance. And so I think that he makes his final choices based on what fits best with the rest of the piece. So anyway, those types of things are interesting just to come across as you're reading through these. So other types of, I'm sorry that my slides seem to have gotten messed up there, but so this is the Scherzo from A Midsummer Night's Dream. There's some sketches for this alongside the Rhapsody, but there's essentially he just turns it into a solo piano version that he would play, and you probably heard this. And there's also alternative ossia passages and things like that that you can see in the bottom. And so that's kind of a neat thing to come across as well. Ossia passages are always, I think they're difficult for some people to get your mind around, because it's basically saying there's multiple ways that you can choose to do this. I'm not going to tell you which one. There's a certain weight that's given to the one that's in the primary text, but sometimes the secondary ideas or the ossia passages are more interesting. And so there's this, it's hard to then define this final text of what the transcription is or what the work is. So they kind of pass the buck to the performer to make that determination themselves. An interesting one is a Hobok transcription. Here's a solo piano version, and then also a violin and piano version of Rachmaninoff. So I have not heard that version. I've heard the solo piano version, but not the violin and piano. To my knowledge, that's the only violin and piano transcription, but there may be others, but that's the only one I can think of Rachmaninoff's. I'm kind of speeding through so we can get to some, just listening a little bit. Tchaikovsky's 6 romances, the Opus 16 set, the first one is a Lullaby, and this was, they were completed in 1872, and Tchaikovsky himself made a transcription of 3 of the pieces from the set the following year in 1873. I've just cut out an excerpt of his version of this Lullaby. So this is something that Rachmaninoff may or may not have known, but in, I think it was, 1941, he decided to do his own version of the first romance, the transcription. What he ended up doing with that is expanding it quite a bit and kind of creating this variation set so that it becomes increasingly more elaborate as the work goes. The first page or so is very similar, not quite identical to the Tchaikovsky transcription. So as he gets going, it makes it more and more Rachmaninoff-y with lots of little added chromatic elements and things like that. So Fritz Kreisler, the Liebeslied, he has, we have the orchestral score, the violin and orchestra of this, and then this was just because I didn't want to try to fit that onto a picture of that. What I pulled out is this little idea he had for this introduction to the piece, which would be included in the orchestral version. So this is just a little excerpt by Kreisler of that. And then when Rachmaninoff did his transcription, you could tell they were in a hurry for some reason to get it out. And it was, of course, one of those pieces that was very popular for him, among other Kreisler works that he transcribed. Okay. So these were all examples of Rachmaninoff transcribing others. Now we're going to quickly switch over to himself, his own music being transcribed by others. There's a lot of music out there that a lot of people have basically exploited Rachmaninoff in different ways by taking his music and using it in different ways, but I'm thinking more of the serious attempts to kind of take one and transcribe it and grapple with it, and ones that we happen to have at the library. So this includes a kind of barn burner Kreisler version of the second movement of the second piano concerto for violin and piano. So it's a transcription of both the orchestral and the piano parts, but mostly keeping the piano part intact. Then we have kind of what is now a more obscure piece, but apparently was a thing for Rachmaninoff, the Oriental sketch of 1917. In fact, we have sketches of that sketch here as well. This piece was adapted by Heifetz into kind of quite a energetic type of work. It's a short one, though. I don't know if anybody knows this piece, but it's short. Another interesting thing that Heifetz did was he took numbers of the Etude tableau and as well as some of the preludes, especially from Opus 32, and made interesting violin and piano versions of those pieces. So here's just one example among several from the collection, from the Heifetz collection. And here's kind of that famous G major prelude from Opus 32. And some of these just, it makes absolute sense once you hear them for why they would choose these pieces to make into violin and piano works. So that's another part of a challenge of transcription is, making sure that it seems natural in this new medium that you put it in. And I thought I'd end with another picture of Rachmaninoff from the Mettner collection. And what I'd like to do is, if there are any questions, I could take those now, but then I'd like to show a couple of musical examples if you'd like. I have mixed answers to that because yes and no, because one is invariably easier for a pianist technique, whatever that pianist happens to do, but oftentimes I figure if you're able to play the rest of it, you're probably able to play the two options or three options. And sometimes, yeah, it's not just limited to two options, sometimes it's multiple options. So in those cases, you have to kind of make a decision on sometimes the piano that you're playing will help to determine it. You used to find that more in the 19th century, you'd find different types of written out tremolandi that would be more or less executable depending on what type of instrument you're playing and what kind of space you're playing in. So sometimes there were these practical considerations that a performer would take into account and be able to, to kind of enact on the fly depending on the circumstances. Usually, composers like Liszt or something would write here's an easier version, and they'd write that next to it so that you knew it, and then you'd kind of feel, a little bad about it, like, I don't know, either hopefully nobody notices or I'm just going to go for the hard one or something. But yeah, I mean, oftentimes it's a question of, not taste, but like a question of just what you think works best. And oftentimes each one is nice. So I like it when, I know it's maybe a completionist in me, but I like it when people do multiple recordings on the same disc of different versions that have the revised versions or ossia passages included. All the recordings, like the traditional recordings that you find are, one of Rachmaninoff playing is 24 minutes, 25 minutes. The original version, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's about 30 minutes. It might be a little bit, probably, depends on people. I'm not sure offhand, so I may be wrong, but I'm pretty. Maybe, and I think the other problem is that that he was getting feedback from, I'm not sure exactly from whom, but he was taking that feedback and internalizing it. He had this penchant for internalizing feedback and having kind of developing a bit, I think, a little bit of inferiority complex about it, when really, in many ways, he could just leave it alone and be just fine. So I'm not.
Or maybe just the fact that when we got to America, conductors were saying, well, you got to take cuts.
That could be too, except that he didn't do the bulk of his revisions on that particular piece until after he was pretty much done as a concerto soloist. He was still doing recitals up until a month before he died in '43. But yeah, I'm not totally sure. But yeah, that's also another consideration, is that cuts were a bigger part of life in the late Romantic times and earlier times. So, but usually, composers still like to be kind of able to control that and try to create a situation in which it wasn't necessary or felt necessary. I'm not sure about that. There's definitely a lot of correspondence and other things that I didn't have time to go through. So it may well come up and be addressed somewhere, but not with these items. You don't find that kind of material. I do think that some of it is, you can tell why he did it. In other cases, it's like, well, it's just, again, I think it's one of those things that he had in his mind that he needed to change it someday, and that someday was 50 years later. But with for instance, with the melody, that one that has the very first one here, it's easier to control the second one, I think, the revised version, and it has a sort of a smoother feel to it than, for lack of a better word, than the first one. Although the first one has its charms, to be sure, and it has this sort of kind of hesitant sort of aspect to it. So I think he just, and it could be just an alternate reading. It could be that he wanted something that felt like it was a melody that was just kind of emerging out of a texture, an arpeggiated, or kind of a different type of texture than what he had originally. I don't know. I think that he probably preferred the second versions. They were certainly, until you had things like IMSLP and other things like that, you didn't have as much direct access to some of those earlier versions, post 1941 or so. It's interesting. Composers have different takes on it. I don't know exactly what his take was on it, but his recordings, if you go by that, he tended to do the revised versions. So it makes me think that they had some of these in his head for quite some time before committing them to paper. That's not really a good answer, but I'm not sure. It doesn't show up as, at least from what I've gone through most of the revisions for the fourth concerto. I didn't see that